So just a reminder, our first exam, our first midterm is a week from today. So hopefully you're going through and giving your notes to look over about every day. If you have questions on terms or other things, go back. You can go to the videos on YouTube. You can come to my office hours. I don't have office hours on Friday, so if you have a question on Friday, you can just shoot me an email. Or we can chat via Zoom or Google Hangouts, because I'm working on Friday. I just don't have office hours. So let me know, and let's keep that on our radar. So as we were talking last time, we looked at productivity around the planet, and as we mentioned, highest areas in the ocean. What are the factors that determine high productivity in the ocean? So, yeah, sunlight penetration, and then what's the other one? So on land, temperature plays a big role. So on sea, in the ocean, it's definitely sunlight penetration, and there's one other one. Yeah, nutrients are the other one, because nutrients in the ocean are normally on the bottom, and that's not where the sunlight is. So where we see high productivity is where high sunlight meets nutrients. And what about on land? What are the two variables on land that predict high productivity? Yeah, temperature and precipitation, exactly. So we can look across the planet then and see areas of higher and lower productivity. And it's interesting to think of our species as being the only species on the planet that can live in places that have really low productivity, right? So for instance, the Middle East and Saudi Arabia in this area, very low productivity because there's not much precipitation. Similarly, these deserts out in the western United States, very low productivity. But people can live there because we can bring our food in and our resources in from other places. But when we do that, as we saw the other day, we create areas that use a lot more nutrients, a lot more energy than the land is producing. So it just means they have to bring it in from other areas, right? So this map means a lot more to other species than it does to our species. It matters to our species because this tells us what the Earth can produce. But because we can move things around, we're not ruled by this pattern as much as other species on the planet are. I mean, you look at like birds, whales, all sorts of things. They migrate all over the planet to find areas of high productivity. Like, we have birds that are here in the summer, and they go down to Costa Rica in the tropics in the winter because that's where the food is. Well, we don't have to move. We just go to the grocery store, and it's got whatever we need to eat any season of the year, right? So it's kind of crazy to step back and think a little bit about, like, how are we different from all the other species on the planet? Whales will migrate from the North Pole to the South Pole to follow their food from season to season. We don't have to do that. So this pattern is really critical to lots of species on the planet. And it does matter to us, but maybe in a little different way. So, because if we live in places like this, we're dependent on infrastructure to get us everything that we need to survive, right? Things like the COVID pandemic happen, they get us thinking about infrastructure and, how fragile some of that is, right? What were some things that were hard to get during the COVID pandemic? Anything come to mind? Toilet paper, right. Yeah, that was a whole weird thing. We could have like a whole class on there's like this weird social, psychological thing going on there. So toilet paper. Any other like foods or goods or products that we had a hard time finding? Hand sanitizer? Yeah, and I wonder if hand sanitizer, so toilet paper, of course, comes from trees ultimately, but hand sanitizer, I don't even know how that's made. I mean, it's got alcohol, it's made in, I guess you distill the alcohol, but yeah, so you think about where these products come from. And as far as food goes, for a while, there was a shortage of certain meats, right? Partly because of some of these meat packing factories getting shut down because of high COVID rates, right? So it's just interesting to think about how dependent our species is on infrastructure and, what are the things that could disrupt that infrastructure? So a lot of people going out, those that could, planting gardens, right? Because you're thinking, I know I was thinking like, well, we used to have some chickens in the backyard. Maybe we should do that again. I don't know. If we can't get eggs, we could run that way. I don't know. But I also think it's so, I don't know, man. I go off on tangents too much. But also, this whole idea of like growing everything that I need, like it's also cool if like we can learn to get along with our neighbors better and help each other out. So that's the whole idea. Wow, I took this picture and kind of went somewhere completely different with it. And this was that map then about the percentage that we use. Okay, so we were talking about movement of energy through ecosystems last time. And if we imagine, we've got a little cartoon here from your book. We've got energy from the sun coming in from space. It's captured by our producers. It moves up each trophic level. And then ultimately, decomposers are going to break down this living tissue when the organisms die, right? But at each step along the way, we're losing heat. So we have this linear process, right? The sun is always shining down, and our producers are taking it up, and it's moving through our food webs. And then at the same time, we have all this energy moving from the Earth back out to space as heat. So how does the movement of materials in an ecosystem differ from the movement of energy in an ecosystem? Any thoughts? Well, so if we think of energy coming to Earth as light and then radiating back out again, mostly as heat into space, we need a constant supply of energy, right, from the sun. If the sun stops shining, we're in trouble. On the other hand, matter, we're not having a large input of matter from outer space. So materials are cycling. So we look at molecules, things like carbon molecules, other things. They exist in living form as part of plants and animals. As those plants and animals die and then decompose, they're in a non-living form again. Then as those molecules get taken up by living organisms again, they're in living form. So the difference is that materials cycle from form to form, whereas energy moves through the system linearly. Does that make sense? So we're going to discuss a few of these elemental cycles. So these are what are referred to as biogeochemical cycles. That's one of those big words that you can just break down into its roots. So what does bio refer to again? Life, yeah. Geo literally refers to the earth, but we usually talk about it in relation to minerals, to rocks and minerals. And then chemistry, of course, right over here, our good old periodic table, right? It's the movement of electrons, the creation and changing around of molecules. So these elements that are important to life are going to move from form to form through different processes. Some are related to interactions between living organisms. Some are related to mineral processes like erosion and weathering. And some of them are related to chemical reactions. We might have, certain substances that dissolve in water, for instance, and then get bound to other chemicals, and then they kind of move around in that way. And so we're going to look at just a few examples of these. We're going to look at 3 biogeochemical cycles that I'd like you to understand in a little bit of detail. Okay. So these are the 3. You don't need to write these down now. We're going to go through each of them individually. Phosphorus, carbon, and nitrogen. So first of all, phosphorus. So this is a cartoon from your book, and I don't need you to reproduce this entire cycle, but I'd like you to know what are the real important processes and how do these 3 cycles differ from each other. And so we'll talk about that just a little bit. All right, so phosphorus. Anybody know what phosphorus is important for, first of all? It's going to be on our exam on Wednesday, so it's important. Well, yeah, I guess there's that. So phosphorus is an important nutrient for plants. Without phosphorus, plants can't grow. It's one of the two main elements in like plant food. If you go and purchase like Miracle Grow or some kind of plant fertilizer. So the natural source of phosphorus is sedimentary rock. So this is rock that's composed of by the compaction of eroded material. So we have rocks that contain phosphorus. So through weathering, right, through wind and water and erosion, that phosphate is released into the environment, right? So you can imagine it like running down a stream, flowing down a river. It's released into the environment. Then eventually it's going to be incorporated into the soil. That's where it enters a living system. So once phosphorus is in the soil, it'll get taken up by plant roots. Plants will use it to make their plant tissue. And then we have kind of like a local cycle, if you see this here. So again, animals, they can't make their own phosphorus because they're consumers, not producers. So they have to eat these plants to get their phosphorus, right? And then in the feces and the waste of these animals, there's phosphorus. And then also when these animals die and decompose, there's phosphorus. It's released back into the soil. Then again, when it's released in the soil, it's taken up again by these plant roots. So we can have like a local cycle of phosphorus that's being taken up by plants, provided to animals, then put back into the soil. So we can have a lot of phosphorus cycling here without any new input of phosphate from the rocks. Okay, well, some of that phosphorus is going to find its way into the ocean ultimately, given enough time, and it's going to settle onto the bottom of the ocean, and then given enough time and pressure, it's going to be compacted into rocks, and then given a couple 100 million years, that rock is going to uplift again and be eroded again. So you see, we kind of have two cycles. We've got a local cycle going on here among plants and animals and soil. Then we've got a big cycle between erosion and formation of sedimentary rocks. Now, why do you think we have a little tractor here in our cartoon? Okay, yeah, so certainly doing agriculture is going to increase runoff and erosion of soil, which will take phosphorus with it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then the other big part is that when we farm, when we want to grow crops fast, we don't want to wait for all this erosion and stuff to happen. So we have chemists to make chemical fertilizer that has phosphates in it. So instead of waiting for this nutrient to be weathered away from rock, we just take the chemical, we put it on our soil. So if I go and study rivers and I look at the amount of phosphorus in the water, you know what the main thing is that predicts how much phosphorus I'm going to find in the water of these rivers? It's how much farming is going on in the watershed. So human society, again, has kind of like short-circuited this cycle. So now we can just put phosphorus onto our land here. Okay. So nutrients are great, right? Because we need that to get the energy at the base of our food web, and that allows us to add trophic levels on. Well, there's a process of eutrophication, and that is where, in aquatic environments, we have high levels of productivity, which can actually be a bad thing. So lakes naturally grow in age, and they move from young lakes that are nutrient poor and very clear to old lakes that have lots of nutrients, and if you look at them, they've got this real deep green color because of the phytoplankton. And so phosphorus, along with nitrogen, which we're going to talk about in just a sec, these are the two chemicals that plants really need to grow. So when you put more of them in the water, of course, productivity is going to increase. And we can get algal blooms. Right? So when we get runoff of this phosphorus into our aquatic ecosystems, we get growth of algae to a pretty extreme extent. And that can lead to fish kills. It always comes back to the fish. Although I don't have my fish mask on today. But wait a minute. Productivity, we said it was good because it allows us to increase trophic levels in our ecosystem. Why is it that we now have fish dying in our lake because there's high productivity? What's going on? Any thoughts? What's up? So the fish, so what happens is, so if we think about when those algae are producing oxygen, right? It's going to be during the day because you got to have the sun. But what happens at night? Is there any oxygen being produced? There isn't, because it's not shining down on there. Are there things using up oxygen at night? Yeah, right? We still got to breathe at night. Not only that, plants also use up oxygen at night. Plants also respire. So when I was in the Peace Corps in Nepal, we would fertilize the ponds because we wanted them to be real productive and have a lot of fish grow. But if we put too much fertilizer in there, the fish would die. And what we would do is we'd go out to these ponds right before dawn when the oxygen is lowest. And if there was not enough oxygen in there, what do you think the fish would be doing? Yeah, come to the top to gulp some air. So if we went out before dawn and we saw fish coming up to the top, we knew there was a little bit too much productivity in that pond. So, So what can happen then when we have aquatic ecosystems that have too much productivity is that we actually end up with fish kills because at night, oxygen gets real low. During the day, it's super high, but at night, it's super low. And the big fish are the ones that die first because they need the most oxygen. So the big fish are the ones that will get impacted first. Now, we have a term that we use to refer to human-caused eutrophication, and we call it cultural eutrophication, right? So this is just basically when human activities, like putting a lot of fertilizer on the land, when that leads to increased rates of eutrophication, which can cause all sorts of problems in aquatic ecosystems. And I just want to point out to you that phosphorus and nitrogen can both do this, although we've only discussed phosphorus so far, but nitrogen can have the same impact. I put a picture of Lake Erie here because Lake Erie was one of the, it's the lake I grew up on, and it was extremely polluted. It was called the Dead Lake in the 70s. The Cuyahoga River, the river that caught on fire, that flowed into Lake Erie. So Lake Erie was in really bad shape. But it's doing a lot better now, but it had some issues with eutrophication. All right. So let's talk about nitrogen. As I mentioned, it's the other, we have a term which you don't necessarily need to know, it's called macronutrient. It's the other nutrient that plants need a lot of. So this is what the nitrogen cycle looks like. So our largest natural source of nitrogen is the atmosphere, right? So the air that we breathe is about 70% nitrogen. But most of that is inert. It's N2, it's non-reactive. So we've got nitrogen in our atmosphere in this inert N2 form. And again, you don't need to know all of these different chemicals. Just know that the important process is that there are bacteria in the soil that transform that elemental N2 into forms of nitrogen that can be taken up by plants. So a nitrogen-fixing bacteria, these take N2, they turn it into ammonia or ammonium, which then can be turned into nitrates. These are the chemicals that you see, like if you look at the back of like a box of plant food, like these are the chemicals that you'll see on there. Okay, so once these bacteria turn nitrogen into a usable form, and these bacteria live primarily in the soil, then it gets taken up by plants. And there are certain plants that these bacteria live in real close association with. Species of beans, alfalfa, some of these plants. They have bacteria that live in their roots that turn elemental nitrogen into stuff they can use. And then so we have the same thing happen, and then once that nitrogen gets taken up by plants and turned into the plant bodies, then those are consumed by the animals. The animal waste goes back into the soil, and as the animals decompose, the plants too goes into the soil. So again, we can have like a local kind of cycle here going back and forth. Well, it turns out there are also what are called denitrifying bacteria. Those bacteria take the usable form of nitrogen and turn it back into N2. So you got bacteria like helping you out and not helping you out. Once again, we've got our little tractor here, our little John Deere tractor, because just like with phosphorus, humans put a lot of nitrogen on the land too when we grow crops. Similarly then, it runs off into the ocean, but it's not really incorporated into the rock so much. It's taken up by organisms and it cycles in different ways. One other thing to mention here is that when coal is burned, it has nitrogen oxides in it, and those contribute to acid rain, which we'll discuss later on in class. So nitrogen can get up into the atmosphere in that form as well. And interestingly enough, NO2 is also a greenhouse gas, which means that when it's in the atmosphere, it helps to trap heat. And it keeps that heat that's leaving the Earth from escaping the atmosphere as much as it would normally. So what are some of the differences between the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle that we see? Good, exactly, right? Our natural source is very different. Without bacteria, we don't get usable nitrogen. Absolutely. What's something that's the same about these cycles? Sure, yeah, they both have decomposition of organic matter that makes it available locally, yeah. So it can cycle here locally. All right, so that's kind of how I'd like you to look at these cycles. Again, I'm not going to ask you to redraw this picture, but just think about, what are the main steps in each? How are they similar? How are they different? Okay? All right, well, let's look at the carbon cycle. So let's start in the atmosphere again, where we have carbon dioxide, right? And so, plants, as they're making those sugars are carbohydrates, so they've got carbon in them. So plants need carbon to be making those sugars. And they get that carbon from CO2. So we've got plants that are photosynthesizing, and they're taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they're turning it into their plant tissues, right? chemicals like cellulose, glucose, all these different sugars, right? All those carbohydrates are coming from the CO2. So the plants take that up, and then they respire as well. So essentially they're grabbing the carbon off the CO2, they're letting the oxygen back into the atmosphere, and they're storing that carbon in their tissues, right? Okay. Well, let's take the long view here to begin with. So when we have those plants, they're going to die, they're going to decompose, right? And so their phosphorus, their nitrogen is going to be broken down by the decomposers. But carbon actually isn't what we call a macronutrient. It's not in demand as much because we've got so much in the atmosphere. So given enough time, if that plant tissue gets buried underground, given a couple 100 million years, that's how coal forms. It forms by that carbon being buried underground. And fossil fuels can form anywhere that carbon is buried underground, given enough pressure in a couple 100 million years. So it can happen on the ocean too. Because remember, we've got our producers in the ocean as well, just like on land, we've got our algae out here. So similarly, when those algae and other living things sink to the bottom, they can get covered over in sediment, given enough pressure and time to form fossil fuels, right? And so one important part of the carbon cycle is this idea that living matter is continually getting buried and forming fossil fuels. And so when we extract coal, when we extract crude oil and burn it then, we're essentially taking carbon dioxide that was removed from the atmosphere a few 100 million years ago and putting it back up into the atmosphere, right? So when we're burning fossil fuels then, it's a net movement of carbon from below ground up into the atmosphere. So think of these cycles as sort of a balance, right? Like with nitrogen, we've got a certain amount in the atmosphere, we've got a certain amount in the ground, we've got a certain amount in our plants. Same thing with carbon. We've got a certain amount in the atmosphere, we've got a certain amount on the ground, we've got a certain amount in our living communities. So we'll talk later about how our atmospheric concentrations of CO2 have been rising, and that's because there's been a net movement of carbon from underground up into the atmosphere, right? Show you a little bit of data. This is a cartoon of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere going back almost 500,000 years ago, 400,000 years ago to the present. And so this is our current atmospheric CO2 level right here. And, you know, in the last, so this is basically how far back we can go and look at ice cores to acquire data on CO2 levels. Like you can go back and you can look at the air bubbles in the ice cores, you can look at the concentration of elements, different isotopes of elements. So you can see the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere now is more than we've had in the last 500,000 years. And the reason for that was because this carbon that was underground, of course, was burned and put up into the atmosphere. This cartoon's a little bit old, we're right up here now. If we look from the 60s up till now, this is what our graph looks like. Anybody know, so this black line is an average. So we're going from 1960 to, what, I guess 2019 or 2018 are the most recent data. And we've got parts per million of CO2 here. And the red are the actual measurements. Anybody know why there's this fluctuation with like a peak and a trough in CO2 concentrations every single year? Seasonal variation? Yeah. And what might be driving seasonal variation in carbon dioxide uptake? Yeah, it's plant growth. Our biggest forests on the planet are in the northern hemisphere, northern Europe, Canada. And of course, what happens in the fall? All those deciduous leaves fall down, right? So all those little photosynthetic machines, those little leaves, fall to the ground. And so because of that, we have a difference in, somewhere between 2 and 4 parts per million between late summer and winter, just because those trees are sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So that's why when we take trees off of the landscape as well, we know that that's going to kind of lead to an increase in CO2. All right, so scientists for a while have been wondering, like what does this mean to our ecosystems, right? Having higher levels of CO2. We as a species have never experienced this high CO2 levels. It's true that there's been more carbon dioxide in our Earth's atmosphere previously, but it was millions of years ago before people were on the planet. Anybody know when when the oldest fossils that we recognize as human show up in the fossil record? Anybody have any idea how many years ago? Somewhere between 100 and 200,000 years ago are when the first fossils that we look at and say this is a human being, is when those show up. So in the last couple of 100,000 years, again, from the earlier cartoon, we haven't seen CO2 levels as high as we see now. But going way back in the day, tens of millions of years ago, it has occurred. We just weren't around. So these authors wanted to try and figure out how does elevated atmosphere CO2 level affect a forest ecosystem. So these two authors, Stiling and Drake, they devised a little experiment. And so they created these enclosures, or these big frames, and they enclosed them with plastic. And they pumped in CO2 to double CO2 levels in some of these patches to kind of see what would happen. And so I'll just tell you right now, you don't need to know all the details of this experiment. Just there'll be like a take-home message from this. And like that's what you'll want to grasp. You'll be able to take that message home. Okay, so then they kept this up for 8 years. And they looked in this forest to see what happened to plant growth and then to abundance of insects. Their experimental setup looked kind of like this. Looks like a giant tent. Looks like the carnival came to town or something. I don't know. So they created these enclosures, and they created 16 of these, and 8 of them they pumped CO2 into, and then 8 of them they didn't. They used what's called an experimental control to create an environment that is identical to your experiment, except for one factor that you're interested in, which in this case is CO2. All right. So with a neighbor, take 5 minutes or so and chat about what you would expect to happen. What do you think happened to plant growth when CO2 was doubled? And what do you think happened to the population of grazing insects when CO2 was doubled? Okay. So yeah, just take about 5 minutes. What would you expect to happen if there's twice as much CO2 to plant growth and grazing insects? What's going on? Okay. So as far as plant growth went, it increased. It increased. There apparently wasn't so much CO2 that it affected them negatively. They did see increased plant growth. All right, so now let's see what they found with the grazing insects. So here are their data. So the red are those control chambers, the ones that didn't have elevated CO2. And the orange are the elevated CO2 chambers. And we've got year on our x-axis from 1996 to 2004. And then this is the number of insects per 200 leaves on our y-axis. So what actually happened to insect populations under elevated CO2? I think I heard somebody say it. Yeah, they actually decreased. So this is elevated CO2. Now it's interesting, for me just looking at these data, there's a lot of variation. Even in the control chambers. Say that again? Right, so yeah, so years that were low in the control were also low in elevated CO2. Years that were high in one were high in the other. But what's interesting, are there any years here where the control is not higher than the elevated CO2? That was a really awkwardly phrased question. Are there any years here where elevated was above the control? Where yellow was above? There weren't, right? So yeah, a lot of fluctuation from year to year. Absolutely, that's real important. But whether it was a high insect abundance year or a low insect abundance year, every year it was higher in the control than the elevated CO2. So it looks like this had maybe a surprising effect on the insect population since the plants grew more. So they took a closer look. These are what most of the grazing insects were. They were these leafhopper insects. Kind of cute, aren't they? Who doesn't have like a stuffed plush leafhopper toy at home? Yeah, so we've all got them. You know, they're cute. They're cute. Do they even have insect plush toys? I don't know. Why do I answer my own question? I don't know that either. Why do I ask about plush toys like Cabbage Patch Kids? And I don't know that either. You know, we're just figuring all this stuff out. By the way, a couple folks sent me pictures of their Cabbage Patch Kids after we had that conversation the other day. So thank you to all the guys that did it. No, they weren't guys actually. That's okay. Okay, so these numbers are a little small, but they're interesting. I hope you can see them. So they looked at the source of mortality, at why these insects were dying. So some insects died from nutritional inadequacy, just not getting what they needed from their food. Then there were some insects that died from predators and some that died from parasitoids. What are parasitoids? So they're close. Parasitoids are like the thing that happens in nature that they don't show when the little kids are watching the nature channels because they're nasty. What they do is they're like wasps, most of them are. So what they do is they fly around and they lay their eggs on living insects. Then the egg hatches, the larva burrows into the insect while it's still alive, eats it anyway. I told you, it's not happy. But parasitoids kill a lot of these insects, right? It's these wasps going around and they lay their eggs on these little leafhoppers. If this leafhopper could talk, it's saying, where are the parasitoids? What's going on? All right, so then here are the mortality numbers under elevated CO2 and under the control. Now, which source, those of y'all that can see, and those of you on this side of the room, my apologies if you cannot see. You can bring your binoculars next class. Which source of mortality showed the greatest increase under elevated CO2? Parasitoids, yeah. It was 3 times the mortality under elevated CO2, greater than 3 times the mortality under elevated CO2 than under the control. All right. Now, the other one that's pretty strong is nutritional inadequacy. Now, why would leafhoppers feeding on plants that are growing fast not get as much nutrition? Any thoughts? So super close. So these are all feeding on the leaves. But have we added any more nutrients to the soil? Which I didn't tell you, but we didn't. So they didn't. So these plants are growing faster, but they don't have any more nutrients. So what that means is the amount of nutrients like per tissue in these plants actually went down. And they tested this. These plants were less nutritious because they were growing faster, but had less concentrated nutrients in their leaves. So a lot of these more of these were dying when just not getting enough nutrition from these fast-growing plants. That was unexpected. They weren't expecting to see that happen. Now, to get at why the parasitoid mortality was so high, let me ask you, when they're not reproducing, what are these leafhoppers doing when they're not feeding? That's a funny way of saying it, but when these leafhoppers aren't feeding, what are they doing? Remember our food web. Yeah, they're trying not to get eaten or nailed by parasitoid wasps, right? Now, imagine that your food is less healthy for you. Do you have to spend more or less time feeding than you did before? More, right? And so more time feeding means less time hiding from these parasitoids. So what happened was these plants were not as nutritious. So some of these leafhoppers died directly from not getting enough to eat. Others died from increased risk from these parasitoid wasps, which are flying around looking for little leafhoppers to lay their eggs on. So I just think it's interesting, when we see changes in the environment, we really have to study them to see what's going to happen, because it often doesn't go down the way that we predict. The plant growth increased, probably thought that would have happened, but as far as the impacts on these leafhoppers, not what you would think. And remember then, these are another link in that food chain, and so when there's fewer leafhoppers around, it's going to affect other parts of our food web. All right, yeah, question.
Were these others the only insects that they studied in this, or was it like, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it was more as insects too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's a good question. And so one thing that we have to do in science is we realize pretty quickly that we can't measure everything, right? So we kind of pick what can we measure. And they picked the leafhoppers because they were the most abundant grazing insect. So they wanted to know kind of how is energy movement affected, right, by CO2. So no, I haven't. In fact, I'd have to go back and read the paper to see if they even refer to other insects. I don't know that they do. But yeah, it'd be interesting to look at. I mean, maybe an insect that has a good defense against parasitoids, maybe they're not bothered as much, right? Maybe they start to outcompete these guys, right? Maybe, these guys are camouflaged, which is an anti-parasitoid predator defense. But maybe there are other insects that avoid the parasitoids better. Maybe they aren't affected as much. That's the scientific method for you. There's always the next thing to look into, right? That you can learn about. So, yeah. Interesting questions. Okay. So we said this already. If you got it down in your notes, you're good. Right. So plant growth went up, but overall survival of the herbivorous insects was down. And this is something that you always see, right? Unless a species is on the top of the food web, it's playing a balancing game. It's got to be out there feeding, but by the same token, it has to avoid being consumed. And a lot of times, feeding is a risky behavior because it puts you at risk of predation. So you see this trade-off in lots of species. Individuals that take higher risks in feeding are at greater risk of being eaten. So, All right, awesome. So I wasn't sure if we'd get to this today, but we are, which is a good thing. So we're going to shift gears now a little bit from ecosystem ecology to chapter 3, which deals with evolution and biodiversity. And in all likelihood, this is the final chapter that will be on our large celebration in 1 week. Okay. So one of the puzzles that scientists have wondered about for centuries is why, number one, why are there so many species on the planet? And number two, why do the numbers of species vary so much when you move from place to place on the planet? So these are a group of fishes called cichlids. Anybody keep cichlids in an aquarium, for instance, or something like that? Yeah? So they're native to the lakes of the East African Rift Valley, the source of some of the earliest human fossils, really where our species arose. And the crazy thing is, in one of these lakes, Lake Victoria, you can find over 400 species of just this one type of fish. Like, not even looking at like other kinds of fish, which there are other kinds. Just this group of fish, there's over 400 species in this one lake. Anybody want to guess how many species are in the entire state of North Carolina? How many freshwater species? We can play the Price is Right. Somebody throw out a number. 40. All right, we're going to play the Price is Right. How many people think it's, and you have to guess higher or lower, okay, everybody? All right. How many people think the number of species in North Carolina is lower than 40? How many people, well, so you all clearly think that it's higher than 40. Okay. How many people, I'm going to just go up. How many people think the number is higher than 100? A few folks. Okay. All right. How many of you think the number is higher than 200? That's a couple. Well, so you, in conversation when you're back home over break, can mention offhand that there are approximately 250 species of freshwater fish native to the state of North Carolina. So however you want to bring that up is entirely up to you, but another factoid you can store in your brain. Is your brain getting full yet? Hopefully not, because the semester is like not even halfway through. Hopefully we've still got lots of room in the hard drive there. All right, so it's kind of a puzzle, right? Why are there over 400 species of just this one kind of fish in this lake in Africa, whereas the entire state of North Carolina only has about 250 species? So these are the kind of puzzles that the biologists have wondered about. Like, why is that? What's going on? So these are the questions that, folks like Charles Darwin over here and Alfred Russel Wallace on the right were investigating a couple hundred years ago. And I'm sure you all have heard of Charles Darwin. You don't usually see this picture of him. This picture of him you see looks more like Father Time. He's got like this he's got this big white beard and everything. But anyway, this is kind of what he looked like when he was traveling around the world, like as a naturalist. Anybody see the movie about Charles Darwin by any chance? I haven't either, to be honest. It's okay. But yeah, so he was traveling around the world, seeing these different patterns in like species, where there were lots, where there were few, and kind of trying to figure out what's going on. How many of y'all have heard of Alfred Russel Wallace? So a couple folks? All right. So it's interesting. So Darwin was kind of born into like the London elite. He was friends with some of the prominent scientists of the time, like Charles Lyell, who was one of the founders of geology as a field. Alfred Russel Wallace was born into poverty. He was not, upper class at all. But he was very interested in the same questions that Darwin was. He just, from seeing species and wondering, like, how did species arise? Why are there more here than there? And so Wallace would kind of like beg his way onto ships that were traveling to different areas, and then he would go and collect specimens from different places, and he'd come back to England and he'd sell these specimens, and he like financed his research trips this way. He was shipwrecked at least 3 times and rescued each time sort of miraculously in some cases. In one instance, the ship he was on caught on fire and he had to jump off, and his collection of all of his specimens of insects and plants was on board, and they all sank, and luckily he didn't sink. He was, rescued. And so, like, both of these dudes were wondering, like, why, like, how does diversity among species arise? What's going on? So you probably know this story, Origin of Species by Natural Selection, which I highly recommend if you're ever having a hard time falling asleep. If you pick that book up and start reading, like, next thing you know, like, you'll be waking up and the alarm will be going off. But anyway, it kind of lays out the ideas of evolution by natural selection, which we'll talk more about either today or on Monday. But this was a real controversial idea because it basically meant that nature changed. And that was in contrast with prevailing ideas at the time, right? This idea called the theory of special creation. And you don't need to know all this. This is just a story, which I hope you find interesting. But the idea was that, according to the Bible, everything in earth had been created within, a certain number of days, and that it is what it is. So he wrote up this whole manuscript, but he didn't publish it because it was pretty controversial. But Darwin was a well-known figure and had written books on earthworms, among other things, believe it or not. So Wallace, in a place called the Spice Islands, had to take a break from one of these trips. He was sick with malaria. And while he was sick with malaria in this hut, he suddenly comes up with this idea of evolution by natural selection. And I realize I haven't said what that is yet. We will, don't worry. But he writes the whole idea up. He writes up this book, or manuscript, and he mails it to Darwin and asks Darwin, what do you think of this idea? I think this theory kind of like, it sort of like ties together these ideas of like, why do we have so many species in the world? So Darwin gets this manuscript and he says, oh, I don't know. What did they say in Victorian England as like a swear word? Like bollocks? Are there others? Is that Australian? I don't know. Whatever it was that they said between their cups of tea when they were really upset. This guy just like wrote the same book that I wrote and I haven't published yet. What am I going to do? So he talks to his friend Charles Lyell, who was another member of the Fellows of the Royal Society there, which sounds like a really dynamic group to be involved with. But so his friend Charles Lyell says, don't worry about it, Chuck. Here's what we're going to do. You go ahead and finish writing up your book, publish it. Then we're going to read your book and Wallace's paper together at a meeting of our group, which must have been fascinating. I hope they stayed awake the whole time. Wallace knew nothing about this arrangement. He essentially scooped Darwin, right? He wrote up the idea before Darwin. But who do we think of as like the father of evolution? It's like Charles Darwin now. But Wallace is still an influential figure. He's known as the father of biogeography. We have all these fathers of things. That's kind of weird. Father of biogeography, and he documented some real interesting patterns in distribution of species. But suffice to say, Darwin is the one who's kind of credited with the whole idea. All right. So we'll just define a couple terms here and then call it a day. So I think evolution is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts in science. You hear people say things like, oh, like if you believe in evolution, then you believe that like we're descended from monkeys. They say things like, if you believe in evolution, like you can't believe in God, or like all these crazy things. And I think it's important that we just like define it and say what it is, and then realize that it's something that we can measure, and it exists. Like, it's not like the Easter Bunny. Not that the Easter Bunny doesn't exist. It exists. Don't worry about that. It evolved naturally. The Easter Bunny did. So the definition of evolution is simply a genetic change in populations of organisms across generations. And this is something that we can measure now. We can look at the frequency of different genes in the population, and we can say, this gene is more common now than it was 20 generations before, right? We can put a number to that. So evolution, genetic change in populations of organisms across generations. The interesting thing is that it can either be random or it can be generated by natural selection. And so evolution can happen randomly just because the genetic composition of a population in one generation is not going to be identical to the one before. Just because different individuals will reproduce more than others. There's this thing called, genes separate into different gametes when eggs and sperm are formed. There are these different things that happen that can cause genetic change going on to be just random. Nothing crazy going on, just random. But when we're most interested in it is when it's driven by natural selection. And so we'll wrap up here for today. So natural selection is this process by which traits that enhance survival and reproduction are passed on more frequently to future generations than those that do not. So it's essentially this idea that the environment is selecting who gets to reproduce and how much. And because of that, these traits that increase your ability to reproduce, and by the way, before you can reproduce, first you got to survive to maturity, right? So survival and reproduction tied together. Any traits that enhance survival and reproduction are more likely to show up in the next generation, generation after generation after generation. So it's kind of like a honing process or like a sharpening process. And so the way that organisms look can change from generation to generation, the way that they behave, all these different things. And we'll talk next time about how this process of natural selection can yield diversity of all different kinds in populations and eventually lead to speciation, the creation of new species, the evolution of new species. All right, so have a fabulous rest of your week and weekend, and I will see you on Monday.